And yes, everyone, it is time for us to begin with the very first session for the Green Literature Festival. Let me give you a brief regarding the very first session, the Nilgiris in Focus, a conservationist nightmare. The Nilgiris, an ecological hotspot, is blessed with the exceptional natural diversity. It has equally been subjected to every kind of change and stress. Can the mountains withstand any more anthropogenic activities? Behind the veil of green lies the stories that have not been heard yet. In the cacophony of videos and voices, we have failed to listen to the wisest of them, all the voice of the land. And now, join us. The three Nilgirians are here as they discuss the conservation and beyond in the mountain district. And ladies and gentlemen, let me take this moment to invite the moderator, Ms. Monisha Raman, onto the dais to moderate the very first session of GLF. A brief about Monisha. Through her writing, both fiction and non-fiction, Monisha Raman seeks to explore the imperceptible connections humans share with the land. Her essays and short stories have been published internationally by several literary and ecological magazines like Where the Leaves Fall, It's Freezing in LA, Singapore Unbound, and many more. Her work has also appeared in anthologies, and now she edits the GLF newsletter. With a huge round of applause, can I please invite Ms. Monisha Raman onto the stage. Over to you, ma'am.
Good morning. We'll begin with a short video clip. Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for today, both accomplished environmentalists, ecologists, and sons of the mountains in true sense. So Dr. Tarsh Thekaekara is a researcher, conservationist, interested in more human inclusive models of nature conservation. He has a PhD from the British Open University and the MSc from University of Oxford. His focus is on promoting more human-inclusive models of nature conservation with a focus on human-elephant interactions and community-based invasive species management in the whole of Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. He co-founded the Shola Trust in 2007 and the Real Elephant Collective in 2016. He is keen on building collective, collaborative structures that work towards building an ecosystem for systemic change and has been instrumental in setting up the Coexistence Consortium and the Lantana Collective that collectively promote these ideas at national and global scales. So welcome, Dr. Tarsh. And readers of our newsletter are familiar with the name Vasanth Bosco. Vasanth Bosco is the founder and lead restoration ecologist at UpStream Ecology. He has been working to help restore the ecology of Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve for nearly 12 years. Vasanth set up one of the first Shola grassland nurseries in South India and the first grassland restoration efforts in the Nilgiris. Close to 120 species of rare, native, and endemic plants are grown and propagated and given a fighting chance in the restoration programs. Over 3,000 acres of land are under various stages of being cared for, restored, and worked through the efforts of UpStream Ecology. Vasanth is also an interdisciplinary researcher focused on developing holistic solutions for systemic change. He is an inventor and he holds 2 patents in the field of alternative technology. Vasanth is the co-founder of IARCA, a plant-based products research company, and he's also the author of the book Voice of the Sentient Highland, which captures the deep ecological story of the Nilgiris based on 9 years of research born out of walking and studying the biosphere. So we're glad to have them both with us. Welcome, Vasanth. I'll begin with you, Vasanth. For an onlooker's eye, Nilgiris is just a beautiful mountain, but not many people know about the diversity in ecology there, from tropical mountain forest to dry deciduous to the cloud forest, and of course the grasslands that hardly catches anybody's eye these days. So, how can you explain the Nilgiris in a few sentences?
Thank you, everyone. Good morning to everyone. And yes, so as you say, the Nilgiris are, it's a very special landscape. It's extremely diverse in many levels. Starting from topography itself, it's very diverse and heterogeneous. You have a series of plateaus which are elevated at different levels, so it's almost like a multi-storied complex of plateaus, and that's what makes it very interesting, because there are mountains which shade off certain plateaus, there are peaks which are oriented certain ways, and so there are hundreds of microclimates and local idiosyncrasies which add to the diversity of ecotypes and micro niches and niches. So overall, there are about 6 ecotypes within the entire biosphere. This is the seasonally wet evergreen rainforests, and then you have moist deciduous forests, then you have dry deciduous forests, then you have the scrub jungle and savanna type ecology, and then you have the Shola grassland mosaic ecosystem that occurs on the highest plateau. And all of this also supports a huge number of plant species. Almost 60% of India's flowering plants are found in the Nilgiri biosphere. And it also supports a huge number of animals. The largest viable population of tigers and Asiatic elephants are found in the Nilgiri biosphere, and of course a huge group of varied types of flowering plants and bryophytes and liverworts and mosses. So it's a very, very diverse landscape, and also it stays true to the recent research just shows that human diversity and plant and animal diversity also kind of correlated, because the number of indigenous communities there and the associated number of ecotypes there is also very high. So there are many parts in the world where this is evident, and the Nilgiri biosphere is one of the places where it's evident.
Thank you, Vasanth. Dr. Tarsh, moving on to you. So an invader came in the 1820s. He set up, he changed the face of the landscape to support his economy and to build up his coffers. And 75 years after independence, we are still holding on to those we've not done anything drastically to alter the face of the landscape, which was, forced on by the invader. So your Shola collective, through the Shola Trust, you do beautiful work with the lantana species, the most common invader that, of course, you're going to speak about it more. And you've done a bit, to control the growth of the species, the spread of it. So do you think it's too late for a change now that a good half of the mountains are already taken over by the invasive species?
Thanks, Monisha, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I think it's quite hard to answer that last part of the question. Is it too late? Irrespective of whether it is or not, I think the only option we have is to try to do whatever we can to try to change this. So I think this undoubtedly is one of the biggest problems now. India has done a great job of protecting and policing its forest areas. The boundaries of what has been forests has not really changed for 100 years in the Nilgiris. There's a colleague of mine at Oxford who did this work. What is forest in 1900s is still forest today as reserve forests and things like that. But nobody has been looking carefully about what's going on inside those forests. And while they've prevented humans from going inside the forests, these forests have been entirely taken over by invasive weeds. Lantana being one of the biggest and most prolific weeds, it's the second most distributed invasive in the world now, taken over huge areas across South India, across India. There was a paper from Wildlife Institute of India where almost 3 lakh square kilometers are taken over by lantana. That's 4 times all the area of the tiger reserves put together is taken over by lantana. It's toxic, nothing can eat it, so it kind of doesn't allow animals to eat and pushes animals out, and it completely changes native vegetation. There'll be no vegetation left. So this is undoubtedly a huge problem. But the question is, what do you do? As you rightly pointed out, the first eradication for lantana anywhere we found in the world was in the Nilgiris, in the forests of Benne, which is Mudumalai today, in 1916. The British foresters then discovered that it's a huge problem and wanted to eradicate. Since then, every 5 years in the working plans, they copy the last 5 years plan and keep putting it, saying we'll remove X amount of area of lantana. But nothing has changed, it continues to spread. And it's for most of us working in this space, it's accelerating its spread now in the last 15, 20 years. So why is this? One key issue is the whole question of fire. Indigenous communities used to manage these landscapes with fire. Cool season burning, very careful burning to prevent large fires, to allow for the kind of promotion of grasses and things like that. That's been entirely stopped now, and so maybe that is one serious change that's happening. So in terms of what we are going to do, this whole approach of funding removal is not going to work because the scale is so large. To remove lantana from around India, we're talking of a figure of something like 150 billion US dollars. Nobody has that money, no CSR funds, no nothing, the Campa funds, no government has this kind of money. So we really have to push for local communities to create a livelihood from it. And that's been the focus of our work. We're making these lantana elephants that are traveling around the world in high profile kind of exhibitions, celebrating human-wildlife coexistence. They are in Miami on the beach at the moment for Art Basel. They tell a good story of the kind of human-wildlife coexistence in the Nilgiris as well. But more than that, we're trying to get communities to pulverize the whole plant and use the biomass in some way. There are limitations in the law. They are still kind of very colonial laws that are stuck, that we are stuck with, that don't allow for the sale of biomass. They kind of assume that they don't want to sell anything, no commercial activity inside a forest is allowed, but they don't distinguish between, say, cutting trees and selling or removing a harmful invasive and selling. So we're hoping to try to change that and allow for communities to remove lantana at scale. And that can easily be extended to other invasives as well. Senna. The upper plateau invasives are a little harder because they're not woody. They are kind of shrubs and smaller herbs that are much harder to remove. But overall, that is the approach. So going with the theme of the conference, I almost feel like while the problems in the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve are very high, the solutions also are going to come from there. I think Vasanth has mentioned this a lot in his book. Around the world, they're trying to remove lantana, but they can't. Australia has been kind of battling it in all sorts of ways. All of Africa is trying very hard. Nobody has solutions. So I am quite confident that the solution will also come from this landscape. And I'm quite hopeful to kind of pick up on Ben's theme on we need hope today. It can't only be about doom and gloom and how bad things are.
Thank you for that, Dr. Tarsh. So I'm going to come to you again. So the Nilgiris we grew up in, I remember spotting an Indian god dung and being excited well into my adulthood. I was not very young then. So now I see everywhere around. They are in my backyard, they are in my front yard. They are all over the place, the Indian girls. And I really, I detest using the term human-animal conflict. So, and I think you also mentioned it somewhere, and you use human-animal interactions. You have published several papers on this subject for your research. And do you think these pan-Indian conservation laws actually work in the Nilgiris? You also see the case with elephants, human-animal interaction with elephants, and you see them on a large scale in the Gudlu region. So do you think these pan-Indian conservation laws are going to work for the Nilgiris, or do we need localized solutions and localized laws?
Thanks again, Monisha. So, I think this also stems from a slightly problematic definition of what we mean by conservation. When we say conservation and wildlife, I guess most people have this image of Bandipur, Wayanad, Mudumalai, Mukurti maybe, these very pristine spaces that are free of human beings. Now, this creation of human-free wilderness is a myth that grew in North America after there was a systematic decimation of the people and the animals that lived in that landscape. When white settlers arrived, they kind of killed off everything. Then they found these big open human-free landscapes, and they called them protected areas, and they called them pristine. When they're not pristine, these landscapes have been shaped by people. So fundamentally what we are doing with conservation in India and the world is we're protecting little pockets of forests while we're destroying the rest. Right? And that to me is deeply problematic. This idea that these little islands are going to do anything to save nature is a complete fallacy. Animals don't recognize these boundaries. Birds and wildlife or nature as a whole doesn't exist only in protected areas. And what we forget is that nature is vital for us human beings. Like a city like Bangalore, I find quite unlivable. The quality of the air, the amount of sound there is, the quality of the water, the lack of any green spaces. There are kind of papers published that show that people recovering from operations who look out the window and see greenery versus don't see greenery, the people who see greenery recover faster. So we know very well that green spaces and nature is vital for human beings, but still we think we'll outsource it to those protected areas and we'll destroy everything around us. So that definition of conservation is the problem at both national and global scales. If we move away from that and think of the whole world as a shared space of urban areas where it's largely people, wildlife areas where it's largely animals, but a gradient in between where you balance the needs of people and wildlife, then it becomes a very different kind of description of the problem and a very different set of solutions will emerge. So as far as wildlife and elephants in particular and the Nilgiris are concerned, I think you're spot on. There was a time when animals were only in parks because they were hunted out by colonial hunters and kind of Indian brown sahibs after that for a long time. But once hunting has stopped, animals are bounding back. And this is not just in India, actually not just in the Nilgiris, it's a national and global phenomena. Bears are coming back across America and they don't know what to do with them. Wolves are taking over Europe and they really don't know what to do with them. Germany is struggling with wolves. So again, I feel the solutions can come from the Nilgiris. These Lantana elephants are traveling around the world saying, there are people in the Nilgiris who are living with the world's largest land mammal alongside them. Surely you can live with a badger or a beaver or a much smaller, much less dangerous animal. So this is the kind of idea that we are propagating, and the thing is, this is not without, it's not a kind of very clean, happy, rosy picture. There are people who suffer real damages from elephants. Elephants kill 500 people a year in India. But the thing is that there is an exceptional level of tolerance. During the course of my fieldwork for 3 years, for example, elephants interacted with people maybe 8,000, 9,000 times. And about 100 of them were negative, the rest were all positive. Literally, it's positive, I'm not exaggerating here. Anybody who sees an elephant, even if it's outside their house, they are amazed and awed by it. They'll stop, all tea estate workers will stop their work to watch animals. If Gore is walking through also, you'll see a whole lot of people stopping to watch them. This is what people pay money to go to sanctuaries for. And when animals come outside, people enjoy watching them. So there is a huge amount of positive interaction as well. If we can do something to lessen the negative impacts, then we can have a very different model of conservation that kind of is not only limited to protected areas, but it's also true that elephants and tigers can't live in Bangalore, right? Everybody knows that. It's not even a suitable habitat for Homo sapiens in my view, but it's definitely not a suitable habitat for large mammals. But what do? So you can have a kind of more zonation or graded approach where the edges of forests should be seen as kind of buffer zones or coexistence zones where you promote non-conflicting crops. There are interesting papers about tea and coffee itself. They have a lot of ecological kind of negative impacts, but animals don't eat them. So they are called conservation compatible landscapes, where the only risk is to human beings and you can do things to improve the safety of human beings. So again, we are quite hopeful that the Nilgiris can kind of push for these changes. We're not killing elephants, we're not killing gore, we're not killing animals as they come out. But can these animals, through their own agency, almost push for a change in policy to allow a better balancing of the needs of people and wildlife? Thanks.
Thank you for that. And for those of you who don't know, people in the Nilgiris have good conversation with Indian girls when they stray into villages. It's like, don't come this way, go that way, that is the route, there is the water source, and kinds like that. So thank you for that, Dr. Tarsh. So I'll come to you now, Vasanth. You live in OT, and like, for those of us like, I mean, both of you grew up in the 90s, as is me, we've seen a drastic shift in urbanization, you know, and there's also the state's laws to promote tourism like never before. And that has again become a big problem for the natives there. And like, there's a big antidote to it, there's regeneration, what you have been involved in the last 12 years. So how do you think regeneration plays a role to, you know, nullify this effects of urbanization? Again, is it too late to hold on to that thought of regeneration?
Thanks, Monisha. So, yes, you're right. Urbanization is fast spreading all over the Nilgiris, and especially in the Nilgiri biosphere, because it's coming from all directions, from the Tamil Nadu side, from the Karnataka side, and from the Kerala side. And it's more important now than ever for us to push for regeneration and restoration. And so one of the biggest changes that are happening now is the opening out of spaces for more ecotourism. And so clearly one thing that's happening is, again, the spread of more invasive species with that. Like, we were just talking about lantana, but there seems to be more and more invasive species. Like, there's this new plant called Senna tora, which has taken over the places where lantana is removed or where lantana is not yet occupied. So there are a lot of nuances that someone who is not a little bit trained to look at, we can just look over. So a lot of the tourists who come to the Nilgiris might just see it as greenery or green spaces. So, and the problem is a lot of the administration also aren't trained enough to see that, or even if they are, they keep moving every 3 or 5 years. So, for instance, one of the most abundant plant in the Nilgiris right now is a grass, and it's from Africa. It's called Kikuyu grass, and it's an invasive species, and it's what you find in all the lawns, in all the English lawns, and it's taken over entire hillsides and mountainsides, and for a long, it took many years for us to convince the forest department and the administrators itself that this is not grassland and this is the invaded grass patch, and that these are not native grasses. So, and we still face that problem. And so like this, there are many small plants which are there, but you have to really look close to see what's happening. So the problem with this grass, going back to this Kikuyu grass, which is from Africa, is that the seeds are like wires and they hold on to your shoes or car tires, and they spread that way. So that becomes a huge problem because it's almost not visible to the eye. And when tourists are walking with their shoes or just driving around, they invariably spread all these seeds. And so that's another thing that we really cannot push for when the government wants to open out places for tourism. And right now, I think there's some 43 trekking routes that are now open in Tamil Nadu, and there are 3 trekking routes in the Nilgiris itself. where tourists can walk almost close to Mukurti National Park. And it's right at the heart of this juncture where this Kikuyu grass now spreads mostly, and then where native grasses still remain. So native grasses remain in one sliver, which is Mukurti National Park, and then the rest of the landscape is taken over by invasives. So in order to protect that, we need to be really careful, that thin sliver. But now with these trekking routes open, you never know what's going to happen. So, so on one level, we need to work very closely in all these changes and dynamics. There's another invasive grass which looks very similar to a native grass, but is completely unpalatable for animals. It's called Valpia mairos. And when they remove wattle, Acacia myeansii, this grass is what ends up being there. So for the administrators, it's completely okay. They think that the grassland is restored. But this is a non-native species which is non-palatable, so it completely doesn't serve the purpose. So, so there's a lot of work that we on the ground need to do in order to safeguard places with healthy, viable populations. But the number of pressures and steps that are happening with urbanization and especially with tourism and the built environment is much, much more. So it's almost like a losing battle, but like Tarsh said, we have to keep doing what we can, and we have to keep voicing our challenges and difficulties in forums like this wherever possible, and that's when we can really harness much more effort we're literally working at the grassroots level. We're working with splitting grasses and growing grasses and planting them out. So, so that's when we can get the needed impetus and attention at that level. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah.
So Vasanth, I think this is a debate that comes up a lot in restoration, so I'm slightly playing a devil's advocate here. There is the idea that invasive species are spreading because of the onslaught of humanity in terms of industrialization, consumerism, pollution, all of that, right? We are battering the earth like never before, and the earth's response in some sense from a vegetation perspective is invasives, that they are taking over more. And then we say, no, the earth's response also, we're not going to allow it to respond, we're going to push that down. That's slightly unreasonable. This is not necessarily my view, this is a view that comes up a lot. So there are people who argue that we should not do too much about invasives. What would you say to that? That's one. The other is this whole idea of rewilding, right? If human beings no longer care about nature, if we cannot rewild humans and have them caring about nature, is there any hope left? So if we don't want people to interact with nature at all, right? We don't want people of Bangalore to ever see nature, then through kind of trekking, or trekking is arguably the most benign. Riding through with jeeps is much worse. So if we don't want them to trek as well, how do we keep that human-nature connection alive?
Yeah. So yeah, that's an extremely relevant question, and we keep discussing that. So what we're noticing is that, I don't know if we can attribute this to a much higher level of intelligence that plant communities or nature has, but it's almost as though the plant communities itself are resisting this juxtaposition that we're trying to do of heavily urbanized, industrialized settings, and we're trying to juxtapose it with our view of how nature should be, and that as soon as we go to the national park, we want to see a tiger, we want to see elephants, and then we want to think that they're happy and that everything is going on good. So it's almost as though nature is resisting that. And whatever we do, remove lantana, senatora is coming. There's something else coming. It's almost as though nature is trying to keep itself protected from this juxtaposition. It's like, unless we do something about the industrial intensity and reducing that, because being in the field, it seems like that, because there's one after the other, it seems to be coming, and it's only in the most remote places or in places where human influence cannot really reach so much that the remnant ecology is in a healthy state. So, and those are the pockets where a lot of the biodiversity still remains and holds on to those spaces, the last remaining places where species and plants cannot move higher, or at the edge, right at the edge of the mountain. So, one comes to think that, yes, we'll have to still work in these places where nature remains and try and push back the invasion to keep these species alive. A lot of the species, for instance, some of the grasses that we're working with was declared extinct, and then we are now regrowing that species and planting it out. So the many endemic species that we're working with which are critically endangered, and trying to plant them back. So I think we have to continue doing that work, and again communicating this to really reduce the intensity of industrial pressures.
Yeah, my next question partly lingers on what you had already said. So, and we'll then open up the forum for questions. So, there were times when we grew up with very little houses on the thing, and now the land use is like drastically changed. And they've even, the swamplands and wetlands have been occupied. So, and there are holiday homes that are locked for a good part of the year. So it's not like we don't have solutions. There are, like you said, there are many communities there, including the one I belong to, and it's there in our names. It's a swampland, it's in the names we give to the places. Like most communities, it's there. It's a swampland, it's a wetland. The names are erased, and of course the new names come, and construction happens, and it's, the traditional knowledge is being lost every day. And also on one side there is that. And then as more and more outsiders come in, and I don't like to use the word outsider, but still people from not who are part of the Nilgiris come in, there's this rising insider-outsider conflict as well. So moving beyond all that, as people who belong to Nilgiris, how can we belong to a place consciously, very consciously, as Rebecca Solnit says, not because we were raised there, not because we built a house there, but how can we, consciously belong to a place? What are your thoughts on that?
So like you said, I think the dynamics of the Nilgiris is changing a lot. I think it's one of the few districts in southern India where the population it has a negative population growth. So a lot of the youngsters are leaving, and this is in search of jobs in the city. Of course, there are jobs there also, but everyone wants jobs in the cities. So all the youngsters are leaving, and a lot of people are coming from outside, and one of the positives is that a lot of the people that we are working with, we have close to 80 different sites now in the Nilgiri biosphere where we are working on restoration, and out of that, like almost half of it or more than half of it is private lands that people have come and invested. They've bought the lands and they want to restore, and they want to bring back native species there. Or it's not always like it's initially just a start or an interest. They come and say, we want to plant a forest, we want to grow a lot of trees. So then we approach them, we speak to them, and then explain that everything cannot just become a forest, and it could have been a grassland there, it could have been a wetland here, and so then a lot of places we are restoring these patches. So that is a positive thing. In fact, even if the locals are selling tea to the people, they are then interested in building a house. It can be of very varied sizes. I mean, I have to admit that some of the houses are huge, humongous, but a large part of the land is also restored back. So in effect, the tea is getting converted into partly built space and restored space. I'm not saying that I think that the huge buildings are also a problem, but we are able to get more spaces for planting, and I think 80 is still a small number, but then we'll have to increase that much more. And there are larger and larger parcels which are coming up for rewilding and restoration, which are part of the private sector.
Dr. Tarsh, over to you.
Yeah, I think, so one of this whole idea of insider-outsider conflict, I think it's not limited to the Nilgiris. It's a problem in Bangalore as well, for example. And the root cause of the problem isn't really insider-outsider, but how much the people engage with the space they are in, and do they have a sense of responsibility and attachment to the land they live in. When that breaks, then that's when this conflict starts. I mean, my parents moved to the Nilgiris, I was born there, so I am also an outsider. I don't, the indigenous people are kind of native, everybody else are outsiders, right? But say my grandfather came to Bangalore, funnily enough, but he spoke Kannada and he totally assimilated and became almost a Bangalorean, right? Whatever the definition of that is. And that is not happening now. The generation of people who move to Bangalore now don't assimilate in the same way because it's very transient. They may come here, they may move to Delhi, they may move to Bombay, they may move somewhere else. It's the same with the Nilgiris. If people come and have a deep stake and decide they want to engage deeply with the landscape, over time they will become locals. That engagement is what matters more than this whole kind of whether they are outsider, insider, what their genetics are, things like that. So yeah, I mean, again, I feel like in everything there is a paradox. There is a paradox of urbanization in that people are coming in, building big houses, concretization, but with that they are restoring pockets of nature. Maybe that's a good thing. But for everything like the trekking again, it allows people to deeply engage with nature in a way that you can't if you drive through in cars, but there is an added risk in letting that happen. So I think the key is that we all stay open as people and don't stick to our ideologies of I am for this, against that. It's almost like the kind of worst case of this is America. You're either a Democrat or a Republican, irrespective of what policies, how horrible the people are, whatever. You're just stuck with that because that's your ideology. And that ideology, I think, is the problem of I believe in this and so I will do it. I'm not open to looking at what's happening around me and changing my position based on changes and based on evidence of what I'm seeing around me. So I feel if we are all more open, there is a lot more potential to find solutions. The challenge is one of scale primarily. Like even in the Lantana work we do, we've cleared maybe a couple of 100 hectares of Lantana and we're trying to restore around the parks. But the scale of the problem, like Mudumalai alone is 15,000 hectares. You add Bandipur is 3 times that. So you have a couple of 100,000 hectares that are taken over. And whatever you do in restoration seems then insignificant. Even if you do 1,000 hectares out of 100,000, it's barely 1%. So the challenge is something you mentioned in the first point, that we have to have systemic changes. All of us as individuals can only do so much. Government policies, government action, funding, all has to kind of change to allow these experiments to be replicated and grown and kind of propagated at much greater scale. And then finally, I think there will be hope. But I kind of try to stay hopeful. The courts are very interested in invasive species. What they're doing is quite bad in that they want JCBs to come remove everything in 5 years. And you cannot solve a 100-year-old problem in 5 years, right? That is going to create more chaos. But that it's become such a national point of discussion. MLAs on the State Wildlife Board in Tamil Nadu are talking about invasive species who would not have bothered before. They would not even know what an invasive species is. But they are saying invasive species are coming over, they're displacing animals, there's more conflict in our constituencies, things like that. So I think this whole discussion and kind of being much more open, watching what's happening around you, engaging more with ideas is vital. And again, these kind of sessions are a great platform for that as well. Thanks for organizing it.
Yeah, thank you. We have a quick 5 minutes for questions. And before we go for questions, you can check out UpStream Ecology if you're visiting Ooty and the Shola Trust. There are beautiful lantana elephants as well, both their websites. So questions, please.
So we talked about human-animal interaction. We also talked about invasive species. It almost looks to me that without the local engagement and the community, it won't be possible. And you also mentioned about scale. It won't be possible for a single organization to take care of everything with the funding and all that. Now, what would be the strategy to educate the local population is my question.
So again, I don't like to divide into local, non-local, urban, outsiders, right? To me, the problem is not the people of the Nilgiris. The problem is almost the people of Bangalore and Coimbatore and everywhere else who are outsourcing their responsibility to the Nilgiris, right? You cannot think that all the destruction that happens in Bangalore has no knock-on effect. All of the resources that these cities use are drawn from these areas, right? So it's not about really educating the local people, it's about educating all people everywhere. We have to collectively, as a race, as a kind of species, almost up our level of knowledge, engagement and connection with the natural world, and all of us have to care more. I would argue that the people in the Nilgiris care the most. Everybody there knows, every day they see what damage is happening to their land, they know. But when they don't have an alternative, is when they continue in certain practices that they know are harmful. Every farmer knows spraying pesticides on your farm is bad. Nobody thinks it's good. But they do it because there's no alternative. They have to make money off that crop. So then again comes in the responsibility of people in the cities. Are you willing to pay more for your food? If you are, then people will be organic, no problem at all. If you demand organic food, it will happen immediately. In the West, all of the kind of drive towards organic is happening from a kind of consumer side, consumer awareness. Because it's large corporate farms who don't actually care about their farm. But in India, it's not large corporate farms, it's all small holdings who deeply care about their land. So if there is an alternative provided at much wider scales, I think that will have a huge knock-on effect in helping these landscapes. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I basically feel we cannot compartmentalize into different groups. It is all of us have to work together, and the responsibility is more urban people than rural people. Right? Internationally, I don't know if you all follow the kind of COP discussions that are happening now. The collective pollution in the atmosphere in terms of carbon dioxide has happened historically by Western nations, right? So we had this idea of common but differentiated responsibility. They have historically polluted. So though we are all responsible today, Western nations are more responsible. And we push for what's called polluter pays. They have to pay more to mitigate this. Now if we apply that same logic, which India is very vocal about in the international forum, within India, collectively, urban people have destroyed the environments around them. They have historically damaged much more, consumed much more, done a lot more worse, lot more damage to nature. Today, rural people are trying to eke out a living there, and we are telling them, no, you have to conserve, and so you are the problem. We are going to educate you on how you are going to better save nature. It's fundamentally, from a justice perspective, I feel wrong. If we apply that same logic, everybody in Bangalore, Coimbatore, Mysore, all these cities should pay a green tax for the air they breathe, for the water they get, that has to go and save Coorg, for example. Right? If we move into this mentality within India, then it will have a huge impact, and that these places will have the opportunity and the funding to solve their problems. So I very much feel it's a collective responsibility, largely on urban areas and urban people, more than on rural people.
I have a question. You've mentioned the problem of invasive species. We're already saddled with it now. And you've discussed various ways of dealing with it. My question is, when you have policies, perhaps those invasive species, there should be a stop at the level of it coming in. Because a lot of countries, like in South America and New Zealand and Australia, they do not allow a lot of green stuff to come into their countries. And that's where we don't have any restrictions. So anything can come in and invade. So like the Dutch elm disease that happened in the 30s, and et cetera, they've taken care. So can we do something like that in our policies so that we do not allow this to happen?
Yeah, I think I can quickly try and respond to that. So one is, for small island countries, it's much more dangerous. So they're very particular. New Zealand, Australia, all of the islands are very particular about this. For large land masses, they are more resilient. So if you look at the history, when Hyder Ali had any visiting dignitary, he asked them to give him a plant or a tree in return as a gift. That's why Lal Bagh is so biodiverse today. It has plants from around the world. So it's not a new phenomenon. I think we already have a huge number of species here. So there is a huge threat. Definitely restricting things will help, and it's happened. The latest amendment to the Wildlife Protection Act includes a section on invasive species, focused primarily on zoos and like pets, like the red-necked slider, for example, turtles. There are lots of pet shop animals that could go become invasive, and the Wildlife Protection Act has been amended to do that. And I agree that that should be done, but the problem we already are sitting with is so huge that it's very hard for people to think about future problems. But I think it's a fair point, but it's maybe not as serious as doing something and changing the policy space around the problem we already have so we can solve it.
Yes, go ahead, Vasanth.
Just to add a point to that. So I think a bigger issue than also the introduction is another factor that's causing the invasion disturbance is one of the main factors. So, like even if you see lantana, the problem of lantana, like for over 200 years, those forests were cut, like 200 years ago. The forests of Mudumalai and Bandipur and Nilambur and all were cut a lot, and there was a lot of logging. And so there was a huge amount of disturbance, and every like moment there's disturbance happening around these spaces, and even industrial agriculture and the use of pesticides and fertilizers, over-fertilization also promotes invasive species to grow. So Senna spectabilis, which is now a huge problem, loves it when the soil is filled with nitrogen. So where's all the urea going? Like it's all coming down the slopes, it's going into the rivers and water courses. So, so there are a lot of these minute dynamics that are happening, which is causing a huge amount of disturbances, and the invasive species are responding to that. So we need to put a cap on the disturbance as much as we can initially. That's what we have to do first, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're really out of time. Yeah, if you can make it quick, please.
How do you relate this policies, because the state policies are there, national policies are there, APD is there, but how do you connect all this, whether they are able to do something really, as Matt was thinking about the policies, we have state, and the other person was mentioning about local bodies. How do you connect all this in a single space, where they can do some conservation?
Yeah, it's a big challenge, that's the short answer. But again, ending on a hopeful note, the 3 South Indian states are very proactive now. They had a kind of common workshop on human-elephant conflict. They're having a common workshop on invasive species. So the 3 South Indian states are trying to be a little more proactive than the center in formulating these policies. So I think, yeah, compared to how bad it was 5 years ago, things are moving in the right direction now. I won't talk anymore because I think we should wind up. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really sorry, but Vasanth and Dr. Tarsh are available the whole day. You can approach them anytime and take your questions with them. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Monisha, and as well as to the speakers. I request you all to kindly remain on the dais. May I take this opportunity to invite Mr. Gopi Krishna Warrior, the managing editor from Monga Bay, India. Please do join us right here on the dais, sir, to present a token of appreciation on behalf of GLF. Thanking our speakers for contributing a lot on this important issue. And now for the moderator. Thank you so much, Monisha, for hosting this engaging panel. Can we please have a group photograph?